So good morning. This is a really exciting talk for me to give because it is actually one of the first times we've shown these data to anyone. I gave a little talk on these data at Princeton last week, and that was the first time we had ever spoken about them outside of a Skype meeting. This is a really wonderful collaboration with TED and all of these folks who are graduate students now or previous graduate students of ours, and it's been a great project to work on. So thanks, Ted, for the opportunity. The question that we wanted to ask with this project, it's primarily a descriptive one, which is more unusual for me. I'm a field experimentalist. We're trying to know whether there's been notable movement toward open science in recent years, and in a way that goes a bit deeper than counting the number of pre-registrations that are posted online, which is, of course, a really excellent sign and an important one. And the reason to ask this question is, first, there has been some controversy, and that varies by field, of course, around some of the practices of posting data, pre-registration, and replication across our different fields. Sometimes that controversy has obscured what we know about how many people are adopting open science practices. And also it's sort of a controversy that's sprung up around whether our fields are in a state right now of crisis and change, as many historians of science would potentially label what we're in right now, whether this is a normal science moving into a new era in which we're practicing our social science in a different way. So I think there are a lot of interesting questions to ask by going a little bit deeper. And so what we decided to do was to do a survey and try to get as representative a sample as possible. I'm going to tell you how we did that. If you look around, there have been a number of surveys. Many of you probably have participated in some surveys. All of you probably were eligible to participate in ours, as you'll see in a second. But the previous surveys were pretty discipline focused, right? So there would be a survey for psychologists. They mostly used convenience samples, and they were fairly small. So what we decided to do was we designed about a 15-minute survey to make it not so costly to take. And we wanted to go beyond behavior to assess, simple awareness of these various practices, which I'll get into in a second, your attitudes toward them, your self-reported adoption rates, which of course we can go back and check. And then also to get at some assessment of what you thought were the disciplinary norms that were guiding some of your behavior. So what are other sociologists doing right now? What are other economists doing right now? So we sought a representative sample frame of both active researchers, those publishing in the top journals, which are primarily faculty, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but obviously in various fields that may include graduate students as well, and then actually getting a representative sample of graduate students alone. And we focused on economics, political science, psychology, and sociology. And just so I have a better sense of the audience here, can you raise your hand if you're not in one of these four disciplines, or if you've not published in one of the journals of these four disciplines? Okay, that's really helpful. All right, great, thanks. All right, so this applies to most of us, although as you'll see, we included some people in the sample who maybe weren't solely focused in one of those four disciplines. So in terms of published authors, this is our best guess at who are some leading faculty in these four fields. We scraped the journal websites for everyone who had published at least one time between 2014 and 2016, okay? So we got all of the names of the co-authors from every single article and their email, and went through and checked those emails to make sure they were live. And then for PhD students, we scraped the top 20 North American doctoral program websites in the fall of 2017 for their names and their emails. I'm happy throughout to go over any questions you might have about the decisions we made along the way for how to construct the sample and so forth. But this is what we felt like we could say about at least folks who are publishing in the top journals and who are in North America. So here's how we went about trying to get their participation. So We did some power calculations following a small pilot. The power calculations, if you have questions about that, were also based on some experimental manipulations we did use in the survey, which I'm not going to talk about today. I'm mostly going to be reporting out the descriptive analyses from this survey. And then following that, we, as they say these days, you can buy the book wherever books are sold. We pre-registered wherever it is you register, so we're trying to be as open as we can and exemplary with this project. So we pre-registered, the same version of the pre-registration in many different places. And ultimately invited about 3,000 published authors over emails. We sent them reminders. And they were randomized into two different invitations. So about 80% of them received the invitation to receive $75 for a 15-minute survey. 20% of them received a $100 incentive that they received immediately upon completing the survey. And then for PhD students, we had learned through a pilot that they responded with alacrity to some lower incentives. And they were randomized either into a $25 or a $40 15-minute survey. Okay. If you are interested, the email actually came with the names on it of Ted and I, and we signed it and included our personal emails in it in case anyone had any questions about whether it was phishing or spam, which some people did have given how high the incentives were. But it really, we did this because we really were, this was for us our best shot at trying to get as representative a sample as possible. Okay, I probably should have made you guess what our response rate was first, especially given what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. But what I'm showing you right now is the response rates, which we think are pretty high across disciplines. They vary, and we can talk about that. So over here in the leftmost corner, we have the overall response rate, which is 46%. The triangles are our PhD students, whereas the squares are our published authors, generally faculty, but not all. And so I guess one of the main points out of this is political science. Thank you. Psychology, my own field, I'm getting over it. I'm trying not to take it too personally. And we actually have some ideas. What we were concerned at first about was this lower response rate, relatively speaking, from psychology faculty. And as many of you might know, there has been somewhat more controversy in the field of psychology. We don't think it's a result of that they're responding at comparatively lower rates. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why we think so in a minute. But these are our overall response rates. If you look at the responses by incentive, you start to see that we might be hitting an upper limit on simply what you can get from academics in terms of their response to this kind of a survey. Political scientists are reacting most to the incentives, and that turns out to be because both political science active researchers and graduate students are responding positively to the incentives. So what this figure is showing you is that it's mostly graduate students who respond to a higher incentive, okay? And then if I break it all out, now just keep in mind in this figure, no one's being randomized into all four of these categories. You're either randomized into the blue bars or into the orange bars. What you see is that in political science, everyone is responding, as you would think, to a higher price. Sociologists actually don't like being randomized into a higher price, and so forth. So it seems as though price doesn't really matter, at least at these price points, to economics faculty and psychologists and even sociologists. So I'm sure everyone has a price for taking a 15-minute survey. We may have reached sort of an upper limit just given what you're willing to pay on these kinds of surveys to get more participation than about 46 to 50%. One additional thing I'll say about this is that we know that we got the emails pretty right. We didn't get many bounce backs. We did program it so that we could try to see whether or not people had actually opened it. I know if you have an inbox problem like mine, you might see an invitation to participate in a survey and maybe not open it. That software actually was blocked by a lot of university servers, so this may be a little bit of a conservative estimate if you wanted to adjust for people who saw the email and decided not to take it. Right. Okay. So I wanted to get into that a little bit just so that you have a sense of where the sample is coming from, potential biases that might be arising in the figures that I'm about to show you on what people are reporting on their attitudes and awareness and norms. I'm going to proceed now just by giving you all of these results. We'll talk about them at face value, but there are a lot of caveats to be made, obviously. This isn't, even 80% participation, so one thing I'd like to ask you at the end is, whether you have some ideas about bounding exercises and other things we can do to sort of temper the conclusions here. Before I move on, though, I wanted to just show you, these are the journals we selected, and I know this is very small, but these are the journals we selected for each discipline when we were scraping names. We thought top journals, but also a relatively good representation of different areas in each field. Okay, so that's the logic here. And I'll just say, for example, this is really helpful for us, these response rates, to break it out by journal, because it did tell us a little bit about why, for example, I'll just give this example, in psychology, why we're seeing a lower response rate from the published authors. And it turns out to be the case that the lower response rate is being driven by clinical and neuroscience journals, many of whom the co-authors will be technicians and people working in hospitals. And so we think that this may be one reason why we get that lower response rate. So that was helpful for us, because the other hypothesis we had going into this is that maybe social psychologists, cognitive psychologists have just been surveyed so much, and there has been so much controversy that they're less willing. That turns out to be opposite of what we found. And then, in other disciplines, you can see that, for example, in economics, it's the Journal of Monetary Economics and econometrics that are responding less so. So people who, are maybe more in the macro side of things and aren't responding as frequently. Okay, so our final sample was about 2,800 folks, above 40% for each discipline, and in the end we spent about $50 per respondent. These are all things that I've already told you. We can discuss some caveats, but especially given that we don't find an average marginal benefit of incentives for faculty members, we think we're doing pretty much as well as we can, at least with the money that we had for this survey. Okay, so now to the question, has there been notable movement in recent years? And this is our first answer. So what this figure is showing you is, this figure is generated by responses to the question, have you ever adopted the following practice? Okay, the black line is the cumulative line of whether you've adopted any of these practices. The green line is whether you've posted data or code online ever. The pink line is whether you've posted study instruments, and then down here is pre-registration. Okay, so what we asked you is, have you ever? And then if you said yes, we asked you, do you remember the first time you did it? So this is a retrospective report of the year that you did it. Okay? And what this is telling you is that, right now, or at least in 2017 when we cut this off, 84% of our sample reported doing at least one of these behaviors at least once, which is up from 2010, a nice round number of year in the background, up from 49%. So we think that, the first cut at this question is that this is actually a pretty steep rise. And right away, though, and I'm going to start breaking this out by discipline and by methodology, but right away you can see that there are obviously a lot of differences among different practices. So pre-registration stays down here until pretty recently, when you see a bump around 2014. Okay. So let me start to look at this broken down. One thing I want to say, though, before we go into each discipline is that one thing we envision doing with these findings is sort of overlaying various kinds of developments, both institutional and technological, in the field in terms of the years when journals started requiring you to post data, right? Or the year when OSF started their pre-registration challenge and so forth. to start telling, if we believe that this is a representative enough sample, to start telling a story about developments in the field that encouraged these kinds of adoption rates. Okay? Obviously, one thing you can do here is just show, the rise of the internet, right? But in terms of making more local and specific predictions about when these things are taken up and adopted, we can start, asking those kinds of questions about how fields change. Okay, so this is broken out by discipline. And so these figures are starting to tell a story that will be repeated over the course of this talk, which is that economics is very often mirrored in some ways by political science. So you see some very similar developments in these two fields. And then psychology is, in terms of adoption rates, lagging behind both of these two fields. But if you look at their pre-registration uptick, that actually looks like it's psychology that's driving that rise in pre-registration that you saw averaged across all fields. And then sociology, we weren't sure how to make predictions about what sociology would look like, but we actually thought that for us, at least, it exceeded our expectations in terms of not adopting at the same rate as the other fields, but still actually on the rise. And so there's 63% of the sociologists responding to our survey who had adopted at least one practice by 2000, or had practiced one practice by at least 2017. And then you can break it out by folks who are doing experimental data. These are non-exclusive categories, so if you told us that you do experiments sometimes, you got put into the experimental category. If you told us you do quantitative non-experimental, never experiments, you are represented here. And then if you collect data of some sort but use it in qualitative analysis and not these other two categories, you're represented here. And so you can see, again, who's driving the pre-registration bump. It's the experimentalists. But there's a lot of posting data and code in both experimental and non-experimental. Obviously, the folks doing experimental work probably are generating more of the study materials, and so they're more likely to post them online. Okay, and so you can break it out as well by methodology, which is represented by these columns, and the rows are the disciplines. And these figures, these numbers in the upper left-hand corner of each quadrant are telling you the total number of people adopting any open science practice in that particular quadrant. And it again shows us that this sample is, pretty fairly representing what's going on in each field. So for example, in my home discipline of psychology, we really don't have that many folks that are doing qualitative research without doing experiments or quantitative non-experimental analysis. Okay. Any questions at this point? Feel free to jump in if you'd like. Yeah.
So, political science looks great. I'm glad to see that. But it's kind of weird because the discipline, I'm not sure how that happened that there's so few qualitative people in that last bin. And so I think part of why we look so good is because there's not so many of them get caught in the survey.
Right.
Because our discipline is like half and half.
Right.
So I don't know how that happened.
So I think that one big caveat that we can just start discussing right now is that we didn't scrape the names of published authors of books. And so political science is a book-heavy discipline as well as sociology. So I think that, what we're describing here is a representative sample of scholars who are publishing in journals. Yeah. So that's a big caveat. Yes. And top journals, exactly, yes.
So I would have thought, I guess, it looks like those are categories of what they ever did, but I would think you want to divide by the first date you ever collected data or something, right? Because that rise is, at least in developing, it's a huge shift towards the number of people who've done primary data collection and so forth. So I'm not sure this categorization really gives you the denominator you need to actually evaluate a trend.
So you would want to see this divided up by when you actually started collecting data.
Say yes.
Right.
Or something like that.
Right.
Or, so you have a denominator, right? There's really no denominator here that seems relevant to me.
I see. What we did is we limited this to as you can see on top, the published authors who got their PhD, before 2010, so that we could give everyone a fair shot. So the people who are in this figure, all were able to contribute at any one of these years. But I see that. I see that point.
My point is someone like myself does that, but only recently, perhaps.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I know in like econ, a number of those journals are requiring you to post data sets about the time that things shows up, right? So
Yeah.
the way they're breaking some of them into some of them. Like, do you have a sense of how many of these are coming from exactly the journals that you scraped, where you're like,
It's a great question. We can now start going back and verifying some of this and seeing, what some of this movement is due to. We can see whether these are the people who are publishing in precisely those journals. But this is what we're interested in is, you can start to parse how much of this is an institutional story from the top down. You can start to look and see how much of this is a bottom-up story. We now have this really amazing data set of co-authors, right? So you can start thinking of it as a network issue as well, right? Which is something I'd love to do. Yeah. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, it would be kind of fun to see journals switching.
Yeah.
So whether the more onerous requirements are actually moving people in the other direction. So you have new authors versus repeat authors.
I see. So the experience of posting, your analysis code is just so awful that now you just stop doing it. Yeah.
Well, you might just kind of retreat because earlier you could do with lower standards, you could
Right.
publish very good work.
That's
Maybe it's
interesting.
like, okay, no, actually, let me just go. I mean, completely anecdotally, a lot of people are like, oh God, I don't know, have a perfectly clean experimental design, so let me go and deploy.
That's
I'm
interesting.
curious.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about that, but you could certainly go into the data set and look to see behaviors over time. These are all self-reported behaviors, and it's a heavy lift to go and look at everyone's CV, but you could probably do something like that. Yeah. Okay, great. So so this is just a quick summary that we've already discussed. So both what we think of as a decade of rapid change due to a number of different factors that we can dig into more deeply, and really appreciate your feedback on this, as well as a lot of disciplinary differences, which we suspected, but were surprised by some of the trends that we saw. In particular, the sharp rise in pre-registration, especially in psychology. And we're really interested in these structural and technological and then bottom-up adoption drivers. So, but let me get into something that I think that the survey has to offer more uniquely, which is asking people, what do you think about all of this? And so we restricted what we asked people about. There were definitely a number of other, as you all are very aware of, other types of open science practices. But we restricted them to the three right here. So maybe the most common or basic to all of these disciplines, so posting data and code, your study instruments, and pre-registration. And just to give you an example, we pre-registered an index of questions that we used. And I want to give you a sense of what types of questions we're asking. So in terms of awareness, we could just directly say, have you ever heard of this practice? In terms of attitude, to what extent do you believe that publicly posting, for example, study instruments is important for progress in economics? And then in terms of behavior, we would try to ask very specific questions. These behavioral questions are no longer about have you ever done this? This is about more habitual behavior. So think about the last empirical paper you published. We also ask questions like, do you teach your students to do this, and so forth. Okay. And so here's a summary overall across our whole sample of what we found. Again, in the leftmost corner, this is an index of what we're calling overall personal support, what we're doing to we're combining awareness, attitude, and behavior. The numeric value itself is a bit meaningless because we're using an index. We're combining all of these questions. And so just in terms of relative position, what we want to show you is that awareness is really high. And you can see this is the black dot is summed across all, or averaged across all disciplines. And then the position you might be guessing. So we've got economics in the green, political science in blue, psychology in purple, and sociology in red. Okay, and so awareness and attitude are pretty high, whereas the more habitual behavior is much lower in terms of what people are practicing for open science. So let me start to break that out for you. We can break it out first of all by career stage. And this finding we were actually quite surprised about. So internally within our team, we had the expectation that the youth would be saving us, And it actually turns out that, so the PhD students are in, the triangles, that they're quite comparable to published authors. When you look at behavior, the PhD students are lagging behind the authors, but this is simply a story of opportunity, right? They just haven't had as much of an opportunity to teach other students or to adopt all of these practices if they haven't published as much. So we thought that this was actually pretty good news, that there was sort of some shared generational awareness and attitude. And then we looked as well at experimental researchers, which are the X's, quantitative non-experimental pluses, and the stars, which are the qualitative or theoretical folks. And you see kind of the same positionality as you would imagine given what we just showed you about adoption rates. Okay? Yes?
So if you go back to the last slide, so even if you're like comparing career stage, I wonder, if you go back to like your incentive story at the beginning, like the graduate students in part might, some of them are responding based upon the incentive that they're getting paid through the survey. The faculty members, I wonder, especially like low response rates in psychology, whether what you're really picking up on here are faculty members who are already open to open science. The attitudes are pretty high here. So in some ways, I wonder whether these like career stage comparisons really are like an apples to oranges comparison, creating a different group of people who are responding.
Yeah, we could be seeing that kind of bias. I think the interesting question, and I'm going to show you some histograms that show you how many people are stating their opposition to particular practices. You actually can see that, which actually comforts us a little bit that we're getting a broader sample, and this is among the published authors. But it's certainly the case that, you know, we could be observing a lot of bias among the published authors. And so now the question is like, well, what's the right bounding exercise? Like, how wrong are we, right? You know, as we go, I'm going to show you more data on this. And, you know, some of the attitudes are so positive. You know, the question is like, are we really at neutral? Is that how off we are? I'm not sure. Yeah. Oh, thanks. Okay. Let me make sure to get through to the end of this, and we're actually doing really well on time. So, so here I just want to emphasize that so far what we're seeing in the data, again taking it at face value, and we can talk more about caveats, is that awareness and support are really high across all disciplines. We were really impressed by this. Even in sociology, where adoption rates are actually so low, behavior is lagging behind those two predispositions toward open science. But that might be expected at in this moment in time when adoption is rising. So the next question we wanted to ask, as I mentioned, is about your perceptions of norms. And let me just be very clear about what I mean by that, because across discipline we talk about this in a very different way. So this is essentially a way of asking, are you all aware of these levels? You know, if we're going to take these levels to be true. Within each of our disciplines. So that might boil down to the question of how many people in your field favor open science. And what we did for this question, a lot of research in the past, we were really happy with the way we designed this question, because typically what people will do is we'll say, how many people are in favor of posting data or code, and you have to give, say, 50%, right? Which is actually a pretty hard, difficult exercise to do, particularly if you're in a field that has controversy. So there are some people for, some people against. How do you represent that in your answer? Are you just averaging the for and the against? What we gave people the opportunity to do was actually to fill in a histogram that went from not at all in favor to very much in favor. And you could tell us what percentage of people in your field fell into each one of those bins, right? And so this is an actual question from the study where we said, in your estimation, what is the opinion of researchers across the discipline of political science about pre-registering hypotheses or analyses? And you were able to do something like this, right? So this is if you think most people are on board, but you could absolutely have a histogram that represented some controversy as well. Okay, so so this is a way of asking, what are the perceived norms of open science in each discipline? And what we did in this next figure, which has a lot going on, so we want to make sure that, I'll walk you through this carefully, so stay with me during this figure. We're going to compare what you perceive to be the norms of your discipline to the actual levels of support that we measured within the survey. So what we're interested in knowing is whether your perception of the field matches up with what we're finding in this survey, right? Okay, so here we go. So stay with me. We're going to go to the top box of this figure. This box with the three, sort of watermelon gradients here is about posting data or code online, okay? And so the first, this line right here, this is the distribution of opinion. These colors represent the distribution of opinion and what we're calling actual, what we found in the survey, okay? So when we asked people, how do you feel about posting data or code online, we see that about 60% of people said that they were very much in favor, okay? And then you go out and you see that, a very small percentage are saying that they're not at all in favor. This is the neutral section right here, okay? The next bar, these are now your perceptions of how your field, of your field. And these are the perceptions among people who actually post data or code online, okay? And so what they're reporting is that they think that about 30% of people in their fields are very much in favor, okay? And it follows from there that these are the folks that have not posted, they self-report not posting data or code online. And this is the percentage of people in their field who they believe are very much in favor of posting data or code online. Okay, does that all make sense? The black lines now are about perceptions of behavior. So this is the actual number of people who have reported in our sample posting data or code online. This is the perception among people who do that of people who are posting data or code online, and this is the perception among people who don't do it. So what we're taking from this is that across all disciplines, people are underestimating the opinion and also the behavior of other people in their fields in terms of their behavior toward open science.
You're sampling representatively. If you've gotten
Only
more enthusiastic over
absolutely.
time, people are part of your sampling.
Absolutely. So there's a huge, like I said, there's a big caveat on this. So I just wanted to make sure that you understand these data first. There's a lot, or this figure first and what we're trying to do with it. There's a lot of caveats you could make about this, right? First of all, our sample, we're trying to be representative, but also only of people who are publishing in the top journals, right? So there's different ways that you can try to make estimates about what people in your field are doing. You could look down your hallway and you could be quite, influenced in your estimate of what the norm is by your next door neighbors in your own department. You could, of course, also think about what's getting published in the top journals. That's a reasonable way to try to understand which direction your field is going. That's what we're representing here. But also, we need to put brackets around the people who are actually responding to our survey. So, Miriam, did you have a question too?
I was going to say the same thing, but one way to check how representative your sample is, your sample of responders, would be, sorry to suggest this, to code all the articles that they publish by whether they're experimental, quantitative, or qualitative, and then to assess the representativeness of each type of author in your response rates.
That's interesting. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that suggestion. I saw another hand go up. I have 1 minute. But the 1 minute says that then I can get to Q&A, so. All right. I think that's fair. Now, here's a lot of color to wake you up this morning. So this is now splitting us out by discipline, in case you're interested to check. So this is, this is the total sample up on the top row here. This is, again, for posting data or code online, and this is for pre-registering hypotheses or analyses. And then we have economics, political science, psychology, and sociology layered underneath that. And so what you see is that there seems to be some sensible variation, as you might predict, in terms of actual opinions. For example, in economics about posting data or code online. But we see repeatedly across all of the field is an underestimate, right, of the actual, what we're calling right now, the actual levels of support in our sample and the actual behaviors in our sample. And so that's the pattern that seems to be repeated across discipline. Okay. So just to summarize this part, or the entire talk, we're reporting out a steep increase in the adoption of practices, as well as some really favorable attitudes toward open science practices, which are shared between PhD students and active researchers who are publishing in the top journals. And what we're claiming, again, with some big caveats that I'd love to discuss with you more, is that most scholars underestimate the positive inclination toward and also the behaviors of other scholars in their field, which you might predict based on even just time lags in between, what you're doing within a research project, and by the time it gets to publication, there may be a lot more people out there who are following these best practices, but you don't know about it until 2, 3, hopefully not 4 years down the line when these papers are published, particularly in fields that aren't using archives as much and aren't posting preprints. So we think, for example, just to go straight to that, we think that there is a role for some further intervention. That's sort of a sweet spot of behavioral science where there's actual positive inclinations toward a behavior, but perceptions that maybe you're one of a fewer number of people who are positively inclined. And so that seems to lead the way to some interventions that could play upon this kind of latent support if you're willing to do it, but just haven't done it yet. And then finally, we're really interested in pursuing these ideas about these structural accounts of change, as well as these bottom-up and network accounts of change for why people are led to adopt open science. Okay. So we'd love to hear more from you. I think I'm out of time, so I'll just turn it over to Q&A at this point. Sure.
Yeah, I'm curious if you are concerned about social desirability bias as well, because it seems like there's a lot of people who are saying, I do open science, but other people don't. So you can see it working both more toward I'm doing it and also the other way to expand the
Right. So the question is about social desirability bias, particularly when people are saying, I do something, but other people don't. It could be the case. I mean, we try to minimize experimenter demand to appear as though you're an excellent case of a practicing open science person. So, throughout the study, we reassured people that, we're not looking for a particular answer. They were also able to answer without filling out as much information about themselves. Obviously, we knew who they were because we were sending it to their email, but we weren't tracking them. We weren't asking them to plug in their name as they were filling out the survey. It's a possibility. Again, we were heartened to see that some people were able to say that they were, against a particular practice. So, yeah. Yeah, sure.
There's studies of surveys of STEM researchers that are reported widely where they find, the same finding that for other ethic norms that are constant over time, that haven't changed, but that you see the same pattern where they say that they're ethical, that their colleagues aren't ethical. And so you might use those to benchmark that because I think we see the exact same pattern.
Yeah.
And those are things, like the other ethics things are constant, right?
Yeah, yeah. I will say as a psychologist that, it's not unusual to find that people think that they're the exception. But again, the question is to what extent does this account for that gap, right? And so that's why these benchmarking suggestions are really helpful. Also, benchmarking suggestions, there's been, as many of you have participated in audits of disciplines where you've, looked to see whether people report in the papers, is your data open? Go and check, is it actually open? These are things that we can do too, yeah. It's fun.
I was wondering how you thought, given how powered, this is super interesting, it is, you thought of how many people to send it to, in the sense that thinking about forecasting, it's great to have an example, but also worry about people getting tons of emails. Do you think that 10 people would start emailing 6,000 people? I'm just wondering, how do you think in terms of sustainability for this kind of surveys, if people want you to do follow-up, what would you recommend? Then you said, we're more powered than we thought, next time we will bring it down to 300, and just having randomly sampled. I'm just curious how you think of it.
That's a really good question. We were sensitive to that because we, have the idea that we would like to follow up with people as well. And so I think that we maybe went for an oversample in this round just because we wanted one, to count, and if we couldn't do the follow-up, that, you know, it mattered more to us to get this. And we were also balancing concerns about power for an experiment that I had mentioned that we put inside the survey. So I don't have a great answer to that. I mean, I think that you know, we were sort of balancing a number of different concerns, and we're not, you know, totally sure about that. I don't know, Ted, if you want to jump in, but yeah. Do you have thoughts about?
No, this
yeah.
is kind of just one question we think about tomorrow.
Yeah.
In terms of if we can do more of this, how to make it sustainable.
Right.
And I don't mean as a criticism, but just as an
Yeah.
open question that I don't think we really have addressed of how
Yeah.
to do that.
Absolutely. Can I ask you to do something impossible, which is to tell me, if you can remember, what you would have predicted our response rate was?
You're violating rule 1.
I know. I really messed that up. I was too eager to keep going. I should have made people guess. Okay. Yeah.
So just to put another thing in the hopper, it seemed like your actual question was an ever question, and your question about others was a do you practice, right? So there's an important discrepancy there that could easily yield this kind of result. Particularly based on your co-authors or something?
Sorry, you mean
the watermelon graph.
You mean the watermelon graph? Have others done this practice? So it did mirror the. Yeah. Yeah. But that's a great catch. We were trying to make that happen. Sure. Actually, it may have been. This may be a. Yeah.
I actually think that can be
Are we
the
done?
next question if we can, if you don't mind. Oop.
No problem.
We have to get to the next topic. Thank you so much.
Okay.